Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our latest Take30 for a Data Advisor. My name is Jeff Spear. I run the information management practice at Ironside, and today I'm joined by Maggie Zeed and Nicole Payne, and we'll be talking about IBM Guardian for Data Protection. This is the first in a series, so this gives us an introduction, and hopefully everyone will be signing up and listening to the entire series. If we could go to the next slide. We do have a couple other Take30s coming up in May. Accelerating Advanced Analytics for Banking, hosted by a data scientist, and then talking about data roadmaps, and that's back with a data advisor. These are all listed on our website. We welcome you to sign up for these. These are all Thursdays at 11. And then if we can go to the next slide. Coming up Tuesdays, we're going to have this series of data on data security. And these will be Tuesdays at 11, and you can see there's 5 episodes here, and Maggie and Nicole are going to talk about them a little bit more today, so we hope to see you there as well. Let's go forward, please. So here at Ironside, we want to help you use your data to make better decisions about your business, and if we can go to the next slide, you can see we have a lot of different ways to do that. Ironside, we can go to the next slide, talks about things from a strategic advisory level, looking at roadmaps and assessments. We also do a lot of design work, and that includes data architecture, data modeling, experience design for dashboards and visualizations. And then we can help you build and deploy those things. So we build data lakes, data warehouses, machine learning, and doing the actual build, doing the deployment, doing the rollout. And it's important to deploy those things. It's also important to make sure they're properly governed. And we work in that area as well, doing master data management, creating a governance organization and designing the right processes, as well as improving data quality and sort of more tactical processes of making sure that your data stewards are improving data quality as much as possible. And then we also provide managed services, so we can help you host your individual applications or servers or your entire analytic environment. So Ironside has a lot of ways to help you, and if you have any questions about any of that, feel free to ask during the presentation or afterwards. We've got a question box that you can type questions into, and we'll have a few minutes at the end to answer those questions. So if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to hand it over to Maggie and Nicole.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Jeff. So just to do a quick introduction, hi everyone, my name is Maggie Zeed. I'm a cybersecurity technical specialist for IBM, covering the Americas organization. So lots of different markets, deal with lots of different clients regardless of their industry. And Nicole is a colleague of mine on the call with us today as well. And we're on the same team, so have a very similar job description. So to get started with today's presentation, I just want to make it a little bit clearer to the people on the call. While Nicole and I both work with our IBM Security Guardian portfolio specifically, today's conversation is going to be a bit broader. So our Guardian portfolio suite includes solutions for data protection and data encryption and even key management. But like I said, today's talk is not really product-based. You shouldn't really hear me name dropping our IBM products too much. Today, instead, will be an introduction to the content that we're going to cover in the remainder of this series that Jeff alluded to. And so in those episodes, you'll hear more about specific solutions within our Guardian portfolio, and you'll actually see into them with some live demos as well. But for today's session, I would just want to kick it off by explaining, this series is titled Not If, But When, How to Mitigate Risk Around Sensitive Data. And the title is a bit cryptic by design, and it reminds me of something I heard when I was just starting my career in cybersecurity, which was the quote, "There are only 2 kinds of companies, those that have been breached and those that will be." But even more recently, I've heard this quote in another variation. It takes the warning a step further and says, only 2 kinds of companies, those that have been breached and those that don't know they've been breached. So especially in light of everything that we've been learning about this week with DarkSide, I feel that today's title is pretty topical. So today we're really going to talk about how to start and how to continue mitigating risk around sensitive data. And to address the challenges that might get in your way of doing this, you need to understand a bit more about data security challenges in 2020. And I say 2020 specifically for a reason. The cost of a data breach, as you can see here, is now $5.52 million on average, but this cost is going up year over year. And it will continue to increase, honestly, exponentially, based on the extensive entry into cloud that we're seeing with a lot of companies. And it's usually because companies that venture into cloud are kind of unsure of the depth of their cloud migration. So in some cases, business units at these companies are just putting information out there into the cloud, and the company doesn't even know it. They're not fully aware of what's happening. So cloud sprawl of data is the result, and it's really difficult for companies to handle. Another factor you see on the screen here that's becoming increasingly impactful is regulatory compliance. With CCPA, CPRA, all of these different states coming up with their own compliance regulations, it's becoming an issue for compliance, and fines are becoming increasingly popular and increasingly high. And I'll add something that we've seen over the last year and a couple months now with everyone working from home. These costs are rising across the board. And with that, it's harder to lock down your infrastructure because it's a new environment for companies that haven't had employees working from home before. And on top of this, right, on top of the pandemic, digital transformation hasn't paused. It has continued to accelerate. And so this became an added struggle for companies, right? So early on in the pandemic, companies that had to adjust to the new normal, as we were calling it, were dealing with simple issues, things like VPN access. You know, their employees weren't able all of a sudden to attend external webinars or learning events while on their corporate network. Their infrastructure just wasn't there. They couldn't handle it. They had never adopted a remote workforce before, and now all of a sudden they had to in the midst of a pandemic. So this started causing a lot of issues. I'll share that for us at IBM, this wasn't as much of an issue, actually. We were already set up that way. I was already working from home like a lot of my colleagues, just based on our job role. So it wasn't as much of a difficulty for us, but we talked to our customers and heard their difficulties and saw a lot of problems. So despite the challenges that arose during the pandemic, digital transformation was already occurring for a few years prior, right? So the shifts to cloud was already causing really forward-thinking companies to rely on applications that were more modern, and that means, you know, they were containerized or they were more modular. Companies had shifted to SaaS for email or for their workforce management. They were starting to use collaboration suites more frequently. And all of these things were really to make sure that these companies could move fast and scale. And with that, data was impacted, right? So data and the amount of data being created, you know, caused a rift in some business operations. Data needs to be shared across all kinds of environments, and companies were finding that they could no longer rely on just ensuring that data could be accessed on-prem when their employees were working from an office. All of a sudden, they needed to make sure, you know, that I, for example, as an employee of my company, would have access to the same data just as quickly when I'm working remote, you know, from my apartment, potentially pulling things from the cloud if applications were out there already. And so, of course, this has changed infrastructure as well. At IBM, we, you know, market ourselves as being able to support distributed, hybrid, multi-cloud environments. And we do this because we understand that no one is 100% on one cloud provider, really. Generally, we see that our clients have, you know, 3+ cloud vendors that they're using in some form. So they might have AWS and Azure and a SaaS environment like Salesforce or something like that. And because we know this and we recognize this, we want to make it easier for our customers to integrate their systems, their applications, and really their flow of data across whatever their environment looks like, whether it's hybrid, multi-cloud, or fully on-prem. But so how do we do this, right? That becomes the question. And what strategy do we follow to be able to do this? So that leads me to Forrester's Zero Trust framework. And this is a big point that I'll be talking about today, how Forrester's Zero Trust framework can help with your digital transformation, no matter where you currently are in your process. So years ago, it was really just focusing on securing your perimeter, right? That was what security professionals focused on, putting in devices to monitor their network and managing preferences to make sure that people who weren't supposed to come into an environment stayed out. But today, there are so many more players that you have to consider. So if you look at this list here, I mean, data protection, identity management, who can actually access data, from what endpoints that can they access that data? Are we encrypting this data? Are we running analytics on it? You know, is this process even automated at all? So there's a lot more to consider. And Forrester's Zero Trust framework specifically talks about data being key. Data is at the center of everything. And then there are layers of how people get back to that data. So identity is one, and you know, the network's another one. And there are other frameworks that take a similar approach, right? So you may have heard about Gartner's CARTA, which is pretty popular. Google Beyond Corp is newer, but gaining traction. The NIST framework is something we hear from our clients a lot about. And what all of these frameworks have in common with Zero Trust is that a layered approach to security is necessary these days. I'm going to tell a quick story about something that I read a few months back. Our IBM CISO wrote an article about Zero Trust, which at the time I was just kind of thinking, oh, this is a buzzword. You know, what does it really mean in practice? And so our CISO wrote an article about a question that he gets often, which is, what strategy do you use to keep IBM protected? And his answer, of course, was Zero Trust. But he made the distinction that Zero Trust isn't something that you buy or something that you implement. Instead, it's a philosophy. And he said he wouldn't even describe or characterize Zero Trust as a security strategy, which is typically how it's referred to as. He said instead, it's an IT strategy done securely. So it really gives us a wider scope to consider. It's something that is crucial to designing an IT strategy today to make sure it is done properly with layers securely to consider what we call the new perimeter, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But for now, you'll see at the top here, right, a paradigm, not a product, that reemphasizes that point. This isn't something that we're trying to sell you. It's not something that you can even buy. So to better understand some of the core tenets, I'll walk you through some main points of locking down your environment, whether that includes a traditional data center, data or applications that are out in the cloud, endpoints that you have like a laptop or a phone or something like that. So starting simply, discover, classify, and assess vulnerabilities for all data. If you don't know where your data is, there's no way that you can lock it down. Next, we have darken multi-cloud apps from all networks. Similarly to the first point, you know, if you darken your networks and your attackers can't figure out where your data is, then they can't attack it, right? So there's protections that will allow your data to become obfuscated in a way. Next is never trust, always verify. We used to say trust but verify. That's probably a phrase that was quite popular a few years ago, but now we say never trust, always verify. The principle of least privileged access is another pretty well understood philosophy, I would say. So for example, you know, why should I as a regular employee have DBA access to HR data and to an HR system? And the answer is I shouldn't. I shouldn't be able to see my colleagues' salaries. I shouldn't be able to see anything in the HR realm. I should just have my normal access as an employee of my company, and my access is determined on a need-to-know basis. Next is encrypt everything, if you can, of course, with the understanding that encryption won't always save you from every attack vector. For example, lost or stolen credentials is one of the biggest reasons that we see breaches occurring today. And someone getting someone else's credentials and logging in and seeing unencrypted data in clear text, you know, it is still a problem, right? Encryption can't handle everything, but it's an important layer of security and a place where a lot of customers like to start. Next is device app or app micro perimeters. So really put simply, just understanding how people are coming in and how we can prevent it if we need to. Visibility and control inside and outside the perimeter. So let's say if Nicole's coming in and looking something at something at 3:30 in the morning from an unknown IP, I probably want to understand this because it's not normal behavior. So I need to have visibility into that and be able to escalate it so that the right people can get eyes on this and understand how to take action. Next is continuous assessment. So understanding the constant cycle that you have to go through to ensure that as new applications come up, as data moves around, as employees have new privileges, as your network settings might change, you have to adapt as these things change, and you have to change your process and the way that you do things as well. And last but not least, relating back to our title today, not if but when, assume breach. You should always assume that you've had a breach within your company at some point, which seems a bit daunting, but it's definitely best practice to go about this way so that you would know how to respond in case something comes up. All right, so I mentioned the new perimeter a few slides back, and something that's important to understand is that the new perimeter is almost that there is no perimeter. The perimeter is just data, and data is everywhere, and data sprawl is a problem for a lot of companies. So I want to walk you through quickly 5 steps of how to secure the new perimeter with digital trust or zero trust. It says digital trust right here because that's the portfolio that zero trust most closely maps to within IBM. We use the phrase digital trust, but just as easily you could throw zero trust on this header here. So before I get into the 5 steps, I'll just explain quickly. I think first it's important, you always need to understand where your data is. And you probably have a sense of where your data might be, but I like to tell the story. One of my colleagues was talking with her client, and they found out that that client had sensitive data sitting on a server that was just being stored in a utility closet in their corporate headquarters, and they had no idea about. So even if you think you know where your data is, you might not, or you might not know where all of it is. Some companies, however, like to jump right to compliance. So a lot of our customers in California, for example, only want to talk about CCPA or CPRA right now and how they can adhere to it. And so they'll immediately go in and start monitoring for CCPA. And that's okay. And that's a good place to start if you know where that data is, as long as there's an understanding that, okay, phase 2 is let's understand where the rest of our sensitive data is. So for now, we'll just quickly run through the 5 components of this process as we like to describe it. And the first I've alluded to, right? Perform assessment, understand where your sensitive data is, and perform vulnerability assessments there. And a lot of our customers will say, oh, I have, a network vulnerability scanner or an application scanner, and that's good. But what we're talking about here is a vulnerability scanner that will detect vulnerabilities as they pertain to data and databases themselves. So understanding the configuration of databases and how vulnerabilities will affect an Oracle system versus a MySQL system, because they're different. So the tests that need to be run on them are different as well. And so you have to understand where your vulnerabilities exist on the database side to make sure that your configuration is up to snuff. And this is actually a topic of one of our future use cases in this series, so you'll hear a bit more about it. Secondarily, we have established identity. So who has access to these systems? What are their roles? What are their privileges? How can I quickly and easily onboard or offboard users for my system? This is a problem that we see, especially in the distribution market within IBM. So with big retailers who, for example, have seasonal employees, they can't wait 10 days to establish identity for their workers who are coming in for the Christmas rush. They need those employees to be able to have the right access and start doing their jobs immediately. Another way that companies address establishing identity is through multi-factor authentication, or MFA. So you see this a lot with banks in the financial sector. You log in from your phone, you have to reconfirm your identity a few times with a text code or an email code or something like that. Next, we have define policy. So really defining what it is that you care about, and then also defining the risk tolerance that you have for those things. So for example, does Nicole have access to this certain information when she's coming in from this particular source program from one of these particular IP addresses during normal work hours? And if any of those parameters are not met, we might want to send an alert. We might think this is suspicious activity. With some advanced or privileged users, we might even want to block access. It depends on your policy setup. And once you have your policy set up, you can get into this 4th step, monitoring behavior. What are my people doing? Are they doing what they should be doing? And once we start monitoring this activity, we need to continuously audit it as well. And we need to understand how access to data might change over time as new apps come on board and as roles change. And we saw a lot of this in the last year, right? Off hours became a little bit of a gray area as people started working later hours because they didn't have a commute and they were working from home all the time. The last step I'll say here is take action, right? And this is pretty intuitive. You need to be proactive in sending out reports and alerts or creating tickets on suspicious activity, and taking further action like blocking a user, quarantining a user, redacting data as necessary if you think that suspicious activity is happening. So from here, I'm going to zoom out, actually zoom in a little bit further by talking specifically about data security. So what you see here is this cyclical process, IBM Security's end-to-end data security approach. So if you read the words within this purple lining, you can see we've got data discovery, classification, protection by building out policies, monitoring, remediation of issues or vulnerabilities, and all of this relating back to regulatory compliance, which is really woven throughout this process. So like I said, it's a cyclical approach. It's continuous. It's not one and done. You have to constantly monitor what you're doing and how you're doing it, coming up with the correct KPIs to monitor what you're doing. And you need to understand when and where you need to make modifications or changes. But to touch briefly on the points down at the bottom, the key tenets, the things to take away when we talk about zero trust, it's data centric. People are trying to get at your data because that's where your crown jewels are, whether it's intellectual data, proprietary data, PCI data, your data is the most important. And as I've mentioned a few times, layers to protect this data are crucial. They're very important. And you need to make sure you have security at each of those layers prior to getting down to the data. Then once people can get past those layers and access the data, like a privileged user, for example, you need to have monitoring policies in place to understand how and why and where and when and how people are accessing data. The second piece of this is never assume trust. So you have to constantly do analysis on how people are coming in, what they're doing to data, because something that I did yesterday or last week or last month might not actually be okay tomorrow or next year. So you have to have this continuous risk-based analysis that all relates back to never assuming trust. But this is where it gets really difficult, right? How do you do all of these things and take into consideration everything that I've said so far in the last 15 minutes or so, while still enabling your end user productivity? Because connecting employees to the tools that they need in a really fluid and still a cost-effective way is paramount still to business operations, despite new challenges and new considerations in 2021. And so that's precisely what this series is aimed at addressing, right? That's what this Not If But When series is all about. And over the course of the month of June, as Jeff shared in the start of this call, we'll be bringing in different presenters from the IBM data security side to tell you the zero trust story as it pertains to real life examples. So we'll start with hybrid cloud data protection. I talked a bit about the changing data security landscape, right? So our first use case will address this. We'll talk about how we can protect you across, for example, cloud, AWS, mainframe, database, file servers, whatever it is, wherever you have sensitive data. Then we'll talk about uncovering threats. So are you actually able right now to detect a breach? Are you able to pinpoint the when, where, what, how, why of that breach? And so we'll show you how our Guardian portfolio addresses this. And then we'll show you encryption and ransomware the week after. Incredibly topical right now. Dark side, Colonial Pipeline, ransomware is all over the news. And actually our IBM security X-Force data shows that ransomware has become the #1 threat type of all threats that they're seeing and that they've responded to in 2020. So ransomware is accounting for about 23% of actual attacks that are impacting organizations today, which I don't think will surprise anyone. Next, we'll talk about a risk-based approach. So understanding that you have sensitive data is one thing, but how do you go about prioritizing your protection methods? Where do you even start? Once you've identified sensitive data, that's really just the tip of the iceberg. And then lastly, we'll talk about privacy and compliance in our last use case. I talked a bit about privacy and compliance regulations at the start of this talk, but as we've heard and as we all know, they're evolving and fines are increasing. And we'll show you how we can help streamline your audit process with our Guardian solution. So in presenting these use cases, like I said, we'll demonstrate how the Guardian portfolio works in action to support that cycle that I showed of discovery, hardening, monitoring, protecting, and really complying across different environments and different data sources. So that brings me to the end of the topics that I wanted to cover, but we wanted to save a few minutes at the end for questions. So I'll pass it back over to Jeff here.
All right. Thank you, Maggie. And we do have a couple of questions, and I'll remind everyone, you can type questions into the question box if you have them. And if we don't have time for all the questions, we'll try to reach out to you after the webinar and get them answered. The first question we have is there an aspect of zero trust that we should prioritize?
Yeah, good question. So I think I mentioned this a bit during the last few minutes, but zero trust is centered around data. So what you need to prioritize is finding and protecting your sensitive data, your crown jewels, really. You need to layer your approach to security, but the first thing that you need to do is lock down your data as best you can. I would say the second thing to prioritize is almost more on the identity and access management side, actually, and it's that never assume trust piece. You can no longer just accept someone's credentials as their credentials. You need to verify with multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication, whatever it is. You need to verify the users that are coming in and, you know, alert on many failed login attempts or things like that. So I would say that the two areas to prioritize are data, locking down your data, because it is a data-centric approach, and never assuming trust.
Excellent, thank you. The next question says, what do I do about users with elevated privileges? If they are in charge of everything, how do I make sure they don't abuse that ability?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and one that we get often from customers. They're always concerned about their privileged users and how can they design policies to monitor their privileged users specifically. There's a lot of different ways to answer this question, so I'll run through some key tenets that I think will help in answering this question. The first, I know I mentioned least privileged access. That's kind of a best practice, a best security practice. Give your privileged users only access to what they need. Just because they're a privileged user doesn't mean they should be able to see everything. And kind of along that theme, separation of duties, right? This should really prevent you from having any kind of power users that can do whatever they want, anything and everything within a system. But I think something that's important to understand with privileged users, they're not untouchable, right? And I mentioned lost and stolen credentials as being a huge issue today. So what if a privileged user's credentials are stolen and then used by an attacker? What's going to identify that? You know, will your threat management systems detect an unknown IP? Or will your mobile device management software on, say, their personal device detect and block access and place their device out of compliance if they're noticing, you know, that this is from an unknown IP or whatever it is? From the data standpoint, I think it's easiest to explain this by saying you can implement an audit process, and this audit process can, you know, work with certain compliance regulations that will monitor privileged user access. You know, I'll say within the Guardian portfolio, you can have all of these users in a group and monitor that group. But you can also design access policies and implement behavioral analytics and outlier mining to understand what is normal and not normal behavior for your privileged users. So I think there's a lot to consider with users with elevated privileges, and there are definitely multiple protections to take. Again, goes back to that layered approach. There needs to be more than one consideration.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of detail. I look forward to hearing more about it. So I think we're at the bottom of the half hour. So if we can go to the next slide quickly, just a reminder that we have upcoming Take30s within Ironside. And then for this set of Not If But When episodes, there's a link in the chat to register for them, and they'll be coming up on Tuesdays at 11 starting June 1st. So we hope to see everyone there. And I think with that, we are all set. Thanks again, Maggie and Nicole, and look forward to the next set of presentations.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone, for coming today.